Be yourself. Everyone else is already taken. It's advice that gets thrown around a lot these days, and seemingly for good reason. Sometimes you'll see the quote attributed to Oscar Wilde, the author who lived in the last half of the 19th century. Apparently, like so many of these simple quotes and maxims, it doesn't actually go back to the famous person. Usually, the famous person says something a little bit more, I don't know, sophisticated and less likely to be able to be put in a quick blurb. But what Wilde apparently said was, "It is tragic how few people ever possess their souls before they die." But the idea of being yourself has certainly been expressed by a number of people. And what I want to do is to look with you at this book, The Sickness Unto Death by Soren Kierkegaard, which was written in 1849. And it's one of the great philosophical looks into selfhood, into being yourself. And indeed, it does carry that advice to be yourself. Everyone else is already taken. But as you might imagine, there's a lot more to it. And we would expect there to be, because otherwise you'd think it would be the simplest thing in the world to just be yourself. So Kierkegaard can help us kind of understand what's going on in our search for being ourselves. So I'll just start with a couple of quotations from his book that will get us started. He writes, "There is a kind of despair that allows itself to be, so to speak, cheated of itself by the others, by seeing the multitude of people around it, by being busied with all sorts of worldly affairs, by being wise to the ways of the world. Such a person forgets himself, in a divine sense forgets his own name, dares not believe in himself, finds being himself too risky, finds it much easier and safer to be like the others, to become a copy, a number, along with the crowd." And that's on pages 63 and 64 of the Penguin Classics edition. And you can see as he writes that, you can just sense this person he's describing, sort of their selfhood and identity slipping away, and it seems pretty tragic. Another quotation, he says, "The biggest danger, that of losing oneself, can pass off in the world as quietly as if it were nothing. Every other loss, an arm, a leg, $5, a wife, etc., is bound to be noticed." So, interesting ideas to start. As I get started, I'd like to put the book in its larger context. So, Soren Kierkegaard wrote a number of books that have come down to us and been considered very important for philosophy and theology. And this book, The Sickness Unto Death, is really part of, kind of, you could say, a conceptual trilogy. There's other books that tie in to what he's doing besides the two that I happen to have done videos about. But the two books, Fear and Trembling and The Concept of Anxiety, really form sort of a trilogy of ideas because they're all very closely related. And so it would help for you to think of an image that I have put forward in a previous video to understand the place of these three books. So if you imagine like a gaping hole, and that hole is just like, you can't see the bottom of it. It's like, it seems to be infinite. It's kind of scary to look into it. And so imagine that hole, and then you have two sides. So you have like two options of avoiding it. And that image can help you understand all three of these books. So when you think about anxiety, the concept of anxiety, that book is essentially Kierkegaard saying you're looking into this infinite chasm. So with anxiety, or dread, as the Danish has sometimes been translated, Kierkegaard calls this the possibility of possibility, or freedom's possibility. He'll call it vertigo, like the sort of dizziness that you get when you can enter into life and make any choice, and you could make the wrong one. It makes you dizzy. Um, he calls it just to be able, purely and simply, can sort of make us dizzy as we look over the edge into this infinite abyss. So that's anxiety, and anxiety for Kierkegaard is both an opportunity and a threat. Anxiety, he says, it's a great teacher. It sort of shows you what you need to do, but it can also be something that you sort of look into the infinite possibility of your life, and you choose to do something that's actually less helpful. Now, that's where we tie into sickness unto death, because the sickness unto death is about despair, and it's despairing of being yourself. So if anxiety is like looking into what you could do in your life, um, sickness unto death is about, okay, what do you do with that? Do you actually become yourself, or do you avoid it in some way? So looking at our image over here, you could say on this side of the abyss, you've got, let's say, a nice, cozy, safe bed, and you can sleep in it. But let's be honest, like, does anyone want to be the lethargic, lazy person who just stays in bed in order to avoid this scary thing in one's life? So that's one option. And then the other option, imagine like a ladder, and the ladder is like almost leaning over, and if you're on this ladder, you don't want to be like the person in the bed. And so the ladder seems to be leaning over toward the bed, and you're trying not to be that. So this is kind of a way of looking at this book. This is either wanting in despair to be oneself, so the person who's like defiantly climbing the ladder, or this is not wanting to be yourself. This is the person in the bed who just doesn't want to engage in the difficulties that come with truly being themselves. Now, the chasm, I've looked into it. That's anxiety. You try to avoid it. That's despair. But jumping in is really what the idea is in Fear and Trembling, which is all about faith. And Kierkegaard is very famous for the leap of faith. You take a leap, and you sort of just trust, come what may, I have to live, I have to exist, and faith can help you do that in Kierkegaard's thought. Okay, so that's a basic review of where this book stands. The basic argument of the book is actually quite simple. He uses a starting point, kind of like he did in Fear and Trembling. His starting point there was Abraham is asked in the book of Genesis to sacrifice Isaac. And so Kierkegaard uses that to explore the nature of faith. Well, in this one, he uses a biblical passage in John chapter 11, where Jesus says of Lazarus, who's about to die, this sickness is not unto death. Well, then Lazarus does in fact die. So it's clear that Jesus means something else. He's not talking just about physical death, he's talking about something else. And so biblically, the idea is the sickness unto death is sin. There's a greater problem that Jesus has come to deal with than simply physical death. So the basic argument starts with from there, essentially. The sickness unto death is sin. And then he argues that despair is the sickness unto death. So if the sickness unto death is sin, despair is the sickness unto death. That's how you understand the precise nature of that sickness. Then what follows is despair is sin. That's the conclusion. So the book is divided into two parts. Therefore, the sickness unto death is despair. He's got to establish that. And then despair is sin. So those are the two parts. Pretty simple when you boil it all down. Now, as you can imagine, he's got to explain why the sickness unto death is despair. Someone perhaps might be thinking, why can't you just be satisfied saying the sickness unto death is sin? Well, Kierkegaard wants to explore in human existence, in your life, what exactly is this sickness? It's not enough, in other words, for him to just say, well, yeah, it's sin, so don't do that. He wants to explore what's going on there. So what Kierkegaard says, he has like the first main section of this part of the book is a really long section title, and it's because he's got to explain what he's saying. And so he spells it out in this section title. He says, despair is a sickness of the self, of the spirit, and can have three forms: being unconscious of having a self, not wanting to be oneself, wanting to be oneself. Okay, so let's just leave aside for the purpose of the video the idea of being not conscious of having a self, um, and let's look at these two ideas of either not wanting to be oneself or wanting to be oneself. So with this, you can see that Kierkegaard is saying, the quote that we started with, be yourself, everyone else is taken. He is saying that you need to do that because one aspect of despair is not wanting to be yourself. But he's also saying you can, in despair, want to be yourself. And that's where it's very worthwhile to grapple with what he's getting at, because he's not saying it's not as simple as, hey, well, just be yourself. Like, if that were the case, then presumably everyone would be able to do it. So Kierkegaard digs into why it's the case that it's not so simple. So let me just give you an example of this approach that lots of people might have toward being themselves. Um, we often hear you can be whoever you want. Well, can you? It's a good question. Can you be whoever you want? Um, Alistair Hannay, in his introduction to the Penguin Classics edition, says, imagine you've got like a cafeteria of alternatives and you say, who do I want to be? Well, I can be whoever I want, and so I'm going to be this. And Hannay points out that what Kierkegaard would say to that is that can make you end up as a king without a country. So this is one thought that Kierkegaard's kind of famous for, to be a king without a country. So what does he mean by that? Let me read to you a quotation from the book on page 100. In this sort of choosing which option you want to be, Kierkegaard says, far from the self succeeding increasingly in being itself, it becomes increasingly obvious that it is a hypothetical self. The self is its own master, absolutely, as one says, its own master. And exactly this is the despair, but also what it regards as its pleasure and joy. But it is easy on closer examination to see that this absolute ruler is a king without a country, that really he rules over nothing. Rebellion is legitimate at any moment. So what he's saying here is, like, if you choose from the cafeteria of alternatives, what happens when you decide, well, I don't actually want that anymore? So you're in despair trying to choose what you want to be, but he's saying you can't actually be your own master here. That's not the whole thing. It is important to be yourself, but that's not the way to do it, is what he's arguing. So he continues on the next page. He says, the despairing self is forever building only castles in the air and is always fencing with an imaginary opponent. Just when it seems on the point of having the building finished, at a whim, it can dissolve the whole thing into nothing. So what Kierkegaard's talking about here is, this is, to use my image again, this is the person who's defiantly climbing the ladder, trying to stay away from, becoming the person on the bed, the person in weakness, the person who can't, yeah, the person who everyone knows like isn't a self. They just go along with everybody else. This person wants to be themselves. And he says, but what if you're not at peace as you are pursuing that? He calls this, in despair, wanting to be oneself. So this might sound kind of tough to wrap your head around, but let me share with you my experience just a little bit as a baseball player. When I was in high school and college, I was very, very, very serious about baseball. And when you take something really seriously, what Kierkegaard would say is you might be sort of trying to find yourself in despair. And this is what he says: it regards as both its pleasure and also its despair. So when I ended up quitting baseball in college, my coach had the wherewithal of telling me, he said, remember, this is not who you are. And it strikes me that he had to say that because he had had lots of experience as a coach on the college level, and he coached a little bit professionally as well. And he would have people who either had to quit or did quit and kind of felt a little bit lost. I had a good friend who had a similar experience. Baseball was kind of taken off the table from him, and he had poured his whole life into it. And he asked me when we talked about our experiences, putting so much into baseball and then it being gone. He said, "Didn't you feel a little bit lost?" And I think that is kind of what we're getting at. If you choose, this is going to be me, and then it's taken away, then what? You're sort of a king without a country. So Kierkegaard has this. Well, he's got several great examples, but one of them that I'll mention just briefly here is he talks about why it is the case that you can both want and not want to be yourself, and why these are actually two aspects of the same thing. Um, so he uses this example of Caesar Borgia, and the actual historical figure who had this motto, Caesar or nothing. And he reflects on that and he says, this person had to become Caesar. He had to become this ultimate ruler, or he was nothing. And he says he's really in despair either way, because in his despair, wanting to be Caesar, he's wanting to be himself. He's wanting to be rid of himself, that, to the self that he was when he was not Caesar, he wants to be rid of. But if he actually attains that, he'll have to attain that and hold on to it at every cost. And so he's really in despair no matter what he does. So is there a way out of this situation? It almost seems like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. I'll just read to you a couple of quotations that are essentially Kierkegaard's thesis, his way out of the situation. He says, this then is the formula which describes the state of the self when despair is completely eradicated. In relating to itself and in wanting to be itself, the self is grounded transparently in the power that established it. So the answer is to relate to yourself, to want to be yourself, and to be grounded in the power that established it. For Kierkegaard, that power that established it is God. It's when you take the leap of faith, trusting that you're not going to fall to your death in that infinite abyss, but trusting that you're going to actually experience the uttermost of peace and safety, being yourself, come what may. So another quotation that says just that again, but it adds in the idea of faith, which is the opposite of despair for Kierkegaard. That was on page 44. This is page 79. He says, but the opposite to being in despair is to have faith. And so what was earlier proposed as the formula for describing a state in which no despair exists at all, the one I just read, is quite correct, for it is also the formula for faith. In relating to itself and in wanting to be itself, the self is grounded transparently in the power that established it. So I'll just conclude with some concluding thoughts on this book. This is like the first book I've ever read where I finished it and then I immediately started reading it again. It's the type of book I'd say that makes you sit up straighter and makes you realize some things about yourself that you didn't before, in a way that can be uncomfortable and that also can really help improve your life. So I really recommend it. The first few pages of the book are notoriously very dense, and they don't seem to make sense to most people. Even the Kierkegaard expert who wrote the introduction was like, yeah, if you just read that, you'll put it back on the shelf. But this book, of all of Kierkegaard's books, is a little bit. It's not an easy read. It demands a lot of you, but he kind of walks with you through it and explains it pretty well. So why bother to read this if Kierkegaard is a little bit tough to read? I'll give just a few concluding reasons. Kierkegaard in his life would walk through Copenhagen and he would just find some acquaintance or friend or someone on the street, and he would have this way of taking their arm and walking with them and talking with them, and he kind of had a crooked gait, and so sometimes he had to sort of veer close to a wall. But anyway, I just get this image of him kind of walking with people and talking with them and really having a way of peering into their life in the best possible way as a friend. And it seems to me that the way he writes is it's it becomes about you, and you're like, oh my gosh, he's talking about me. And like I said, that can be sort of a friendly, sort of like a friend walking with you sort of feeling. Um, you will think as you read it, you'll come to points where you say, "Oh my gosh, he's talking about me. Like, how did he know this?" Um, and those moments are really quite interesting because they'll show you what you have learned in your life. They'll kind of affirm you in a lot of ways. They'll show you the things that you haven't learned, and you'll puzzle over some things, and we'll be sure that you can agree with some things. But usually he's probably right if you think about it a little bit more. But um, very interesting. Also, I just think of self help as being a genre, but this is like the most grounded form of self. And I pause there, self help, because it is a book all about the self, what it means to be a self. And this is truly grounded, um, deep, rich thought on selfhood, being yourself. And there's so much self help out there, and most of it is like it's got something good about it, which is why it's able to market itself, but it's also kind of like gimmicky sometimes and just paying attention to fads. One of those fads I started with, be yourself, everyone else has already taken. But this book would say, no, that is not just it. That's on to something, but it's actually surface level. So let's go deeper. So if you like real self help, this book is definitely for you. Um, if you've been one of those people who has thought, and you can do this in a number of ways, I don't want to be like them, but you didn't find yourself at peace with that, Kierkegaard can help you explain why. Some people are kind of over here and they want to, just keep things the way they are. They don't want to be like them. And other people are over here and they're like, no, I don't want to be like them. And they kind of are defiantly climbing the ladder. And Kierkegaard helps you to see that what you might be missing. He helps you to point that out. Lastly, the way Kierkegaard presents Christianity and Christianity's answer to selfhood is very refreshing to me because he doesn't present Christianity as something to kind of like prove or disprove before you listen to it. He presents it more as something to be believed. And once you believe it, he shows how it really helps you uh, find the most out of your spirit. And I'll conclude with that thought because Kierkegaard would say that the spirit is the self. And all of our journeys in life ultimately are about figuring out who we are in this world. Whether we refer to that as spirituality or not, Kierkegaard certainly does. That's really what our journey is all about. And so I would invite you to consider giving The Sickness Unto Death a read for yourself.